Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Alana Steinhain. We're going to do something a little different today. We are going to talk theology because the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Nun Dalet Amud Bet 54b, discusses a concept called Olam Kiminhago Noheg. The world works how it works. Essentially, I would say the world follows natural law. This is used to explain why things that God doesn't want to happen continue to happen. So, for example, why idols were able to persist in the world, why the sun would continue to be worshipped, why it should continue to exist if it's worshipped, why people who commit adultery might bear children through that union, why somebody who steals a seed can plant it and it becomes a plant, because the world works by natural laws. We know that gravity is a good example. And yet, as religious people, we have to ask the question, what about miracles? What about divine providence? Where does that fit in Olam Ki Minhago Noheg? So I want to take a little bit of a closer look in Chazal, and then I want to look at the way that the Rambam and the Ramban, respectively, understand this klal, this concept, because they are going to differ from one another rather markedly. And they present us with a kind of opposition and maybe a kind of spectrum of the religious personality, from the hyper-rational to the hyper-mystical. So let's start with Chazal. Chazal actually talk about Olam Ki Minhago Noheg specifically in the context of Avodah Zarah in three different places. In the Tosefta, which is edited around the time of the Mishnah, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, edited around 425 Common Era, and in the Bavli, edited anywhere between 600 and the 8th century, mid 8th century. So in the Tosefta, the way it's described is similar to in the Bavli, but there are components missing or components done a little differently. Let's take a look. Shalu filosofin et hazakenim beromi im ein rtzono ba'avodat kochavim mipnei ma eno mevatla. Why doesn't God destroy Avodah Zarah if God doesn't want it? And it's interesting, especially in the context of talking about bitul Avodah Zarah, what actions a non-Jew can take to nullify their Avodah Zarah for a Jew to be able to use that item. It's interesting to use that terminology. Why doesn't God destroy it? If they would worship something that the world didn't need, God would destroy what they worship. But just waiting for a siren to pass by. Sounds like a fire truck. They worship the sun, the moon, the stars, and the constellations, and the planets. Should God destroy the world because of these morons? Rather, let the world work how it works, meaning have a sun, have a moon, have stars, etc. And people who do the wrong thing, they'll have to pay for it later. Likewise, if a person stole seeds to sow them, aren't they going to grow? If a man sleeps with a married woman, isn't a baby going to come out of that? Let the world work how it works. When there's a sexual union, conception may come out of it. When there's a seed that's planted, it will grow in the right conditions. There's a sun that's going to rise and set. Vishotim shekil kalu yavo v'yitnu et hadin. And people who are morons and do the wrong thing, and I'm just saying morons because that's the way it's being used here. It's not being used in the clinical terminology of Shota. When they do the wrong thing, they're going to have to pay for it. In other words, God is not going to uproot the world because people do bad. The Talmud Yerushalmi basically says the same thing, except it's interesting to note that in the example of adultery, It says, Haba al eshet ish, a man who sleeps with a married woman, ein sofo leholid mamzer, aren't they going to have a child who is illegitimate? And that I think is very interesting because I do wonder if part of the question here is not just, hey, it's not fair that when you plant a stolen seed, it still grows for you. The other side of the coin is, hey, it's not fair. These people who committed adultery, now there's a child born of it that suffers for what they did. And yet God doesn't stop that, right? So there's a little bit of, you know, Tzaddik Viralo kind of thing, a little bit of theodicy, unfairness to this child. Why doesn't God step in? And the answer is, let the world work the way that it works, right? There's going to be laws of nature. There's going to be a way that things work. What I think is so interesting about what the Bavli does with this, I think it's really interesting that the Bavli adds something from Reish Lakish after this description. And it goes like this. This is what Reish Lakish said. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Lo dayan le'rishaim shosin sela sheli pumbi. Isn't it enough that the wicked make my coinage as though it's hefker, as though it's ownerless? Now we know coinage is another way, it's a metaphor for human beings, right? God mints coins. God mints all of us. But more than that, they actually force me to put my seal on it. In other words, in a situation, for instance, where two people commit adultery and a child is born of that, God is basically saying, against my will, and I'm going to add something, using your free will, against my will, because the laws of nature are such that you could conceive through this transgressive act. You're forcing me. You're forcing the use of my imprint of Tselem Elokim by making a baby out of this transgressive move. God doesn't want it either, right? So this kind of adds a layer, I think, of God essentially saying human beings can sometimes do things that quote unquote force God's hand. So kind of three different perspectives. One, sort of the default of human beings are not going to destroy God's world. So God is going to let the sun exist. The second layer that the Yerushalmi possibly adds implicitly, hey, it's not fair that a mamzer or a mamzeret should be born of this union. God should step in, but that's not what God does. And three, God saying, not fair to me what you're doing. Not fair to me. You are using Tselem Elokim in all the wrong ways and creating new Tselem Elokim through the wrong means. Let's take a look at what medievalists do with this. Because unlike Chazal, who I think because of their varied time and place and their breakdown into different schools of thought and different individual rabbis and the premium placed on machloket, you don't always have consistency in the ideology and ideologies of Chazal. But in the Rambam and the Ramban, in medieval philosophy, you are supposed to have consistency. And so I'm curious to see how the Rambam and how the Ramban, respectively, deal with Olam Kiminago Nohek. How do they square it with some of the bigger questions about Nisim, right? About miracles. And so the Rambam, who is such a deep rationalist when it comes to religion, very Aristotelian in the sense that whatever can be natural should be natural. He is going to actually take Olam Kiminago Noheg and he's going to make it his calling card and essentially say, see, the world works through nature. And then the burden is going to be on him to figure out, well, what do I think? How do miracles happen if everything is supposed to be through natural law? What correlates to this also is he's going to have a major emphasis on human choice, right? Free will. God's not forcing us. Free will. So let's take a look at his Shmona Prakim. That's his introduction to Pirkei Avot, where he talks about this topic. He says, Omnam ha'ma'amar mefursam bein habriot. You'll hear among a lot of people. Ve'efshar limtso me'ein ze b'sichat chachamim. V'katuv b'sfarim. You'll even find it among scholars and in books. Shekimat ha'adam v'yeshivato. V'chol tnuotav. Hein b'chefetz Hashem yitbarach u'rtzono. That a person literally, physically, standing up, sitting down, any movements that they make are all through God's will and desire. In a sense of being like a marionette. I move my hand this way, God wanted me to move my hand that way. I take a breath in, God wanted me to take a breath in. Now, the Rambam is not going to agree with this, but he is going to say, well, sure, it's all according to God's will, but not like a marionette, like something else. Laws of nature, those are God's will too. So let's take a look. He says, Humamar nachon rak mitzad yadua. He says, this is true only in one particular way. It's like an example of somebody who throws a rock up into the air and the rock goes downwards, what we would call gravity. If we said about that, that it was due to God's will that stone went downwards. To an extent, that's true. In what way? Because God wants there, meaning it was divine will, that there should be a center in the earth. And that anything that would be thrown upwards, like anything from the earth that would be thrown upwards, it would come back to the center. That's how he's explaining what we would call gravity. And likewise, fire, which the flames rise upwards. That's not because God is marionetting it at that moment, puppeting the fire, but because God's will was that it was inscribed into nature, that's the way fire would work. So certainly, when I move my hands or move my arms, sure, that's God's will. It's God's will, not because God, has some invisible string pulling my hands, but because God's will was that human beings would be created with this possibility of moving and doing and breathing and hearts beating, right? Laws of nature. And then he says there are people who disagree with this, and he actually quotes what we think is a Muslim sect because he's very engaged in thinking through in comparative religious categories based on things that he's reading. And he says, I want you to know that's what Jews believe. And this is why the sages said, all of the wonders that are abnormal, that are what we might call paranormal, that were or that will be based on destiny, kulam kadam lahem achefetz b'sheshet yimei breshit. All of those things, the divine will inscribed them already in the 6 days of Breshit. Now remember, I told you Shmona Prakim was his introduction to Pirkei Avot. So what's he referring to? He's referring to the 10 things that were created bein hashmashot in twilight on Erev Shabbat, according to the Mishnah and Avot. And of course, some of those 10 things are miraculous, like the mouth of Bilam's donkey, right? So, or the mouth of the earth that swallows up in the situation of Korach, right? So what he wants is he wants there to be miracles, sure, but those miracles have to be inscribed in nature because the world works through the laws of nature. V'husam b'teva hadvarim me'ota sha'av elach, and already in nature were inscribed those things from that moment and on, shitrachesh behem ma shitrachesh, that whatever would happen to them will happen, right? So the parting of the Red Sea, already inscribed into nature at the very beginning. Now, this is really fascinating because given the fact that he believes that the world works through natural law, he has to figure out a way to explain how miracles can occur. And one resolution is the resolution that he's offering here, which is that miracles were inscribed in the creation of nature itself from the beginning. There are other resolutions, by the way, and I'm including on the sources a link to an article by Hannah Kasher about his other resolutions as well, because it's fascinating. Then he continues and gets to Olam Kiminago Noheg. V'od lahem ma'amar be'inyan hazeh. The rabbis have something that they say about this. Olam Kiminago Noheg. The world works how it works. But Timtseim Tamid, you're always going to find B'chol Divrehim Aleim Shalom, everything that they say, they have blessed memory. Shenimnaim mitei taratzon b'davar achar davar be'et acharet. They try not to talk about the divine will as something that marionettes from minute to minute. Okay, it has to be about natural law. Now, of course, he then has to focus on if God's not marionetting the way I move my hand, then what is deciding the way I move my hand? Bechira chofshit, my own decisions. So he says, Klalo shel davar sheta'amin, here's what you're supposed to believe. Shekeshem shechafetz ha'elokim she'yeh adam zakuf koma rechav chazeh ba'al etzba'ot, just like God wanted humanity to be standing upright, broad-chested, have fingers. Kach chafetz she'yeh mitnoeh v'nach me'atzmo. God willed it, desired that human beings can move or rest at will. They can do things based on their own will. God doesn't force them to do it. God doesn't keep them from doing it. As the true Torah teaches us. Right? So the idea is, God inscribes into nature, human capacity for free will. There's more here. Feel free to read. Feel free to read the article that I gave you as well. I also want to add that the Rambam is so committed to Olam Kiminago Noheg as a sense of laws of nature that he wants you to make sure that when he's talking about the Messianic era in his Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Malachim, the laws of kings and their wars, Milchamoteim, that you don't think that in the days of the Messiah, the laws of nature will change either. They won't. He says, Al yaleh al halev shebimot HaMashiach yivatel davar miminago shel olam. I don't want you to think that anything is going to change from the way the world works in the days of the Messiah. O sheyeh shum chidush b'maaseh bereshit, or that there will be anything new created, meaning creation happened already. God created the world and inscribed things into it already. There is no new creation. Ela olam kiminago noheg. The world works how it works. And then he says, well, then how do I explain things like begar ze'ev im keves, that the lion and that the wolf and the lamb are going to be able to settle together, to live together? He says it's a mashal. It's a metaphor. Everyone's going to believe in God, be their best selves, and bad guys and good guys, no such thing. Everyone's going to be good guys. So there's no wolf, there's no lamb. Everybody's just lambs. Okay? It's a metaphor. So that's the Rambam. And I think it's really interesting to think that, the Rambam, he's so consistent. He's so consistent. But I do just want to say that there are others who are medievals as well, such as the Akedat Yitzchak, who's centuries later than the Rambam. He's 15th century, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. And he basically indicates that God has two modes. God has the mode of Elokim, which is what we usually call din, we usually call justice, but he says rules of nature. That's why the description of creation is Elokim. Vayomer Elokim, Vayomer Elokim, Vayomer Elokim. Right? God sets down din, rules of nature. And then there's Yud Kei Vav Kei. There's Hashem. And Hashem, as Rachamim, that's intervenes in rules of nature. upends rules of nature. Really interesting. I included it for you here as well. For the Rambam, that's not what he's doing. Okay. God is a complete unity. Creation is something that happened once, everything was inscribed within it. The world works through natural law. Now, the Ramban, on the other hand, oh my, very much at the opposite end of the spectrum. The Ramban, not only does the Ramban not have to explain miracles, it's the reverse. Miracles are the default. The Ramban has to explain what gravity is, right? Which, by the way, it's interesting because in some ways that's what the Gemara in Avodah Zarah and Daled Amud Bet is doing, right? It's basically saying, why doesn't God intervene? We assume God intervenes. We assume God intervenes, right? So for the Ramban, that is his working assumption. So on the pasuk in Shemot Yud Gimel, Exodus chapter 13, about a pasuk about wearing tefillin that describes that the reason for wearing tefillin is as a sign that God took us out of Egypt. The Ramban, waxes poetic about the importance of miracles and knowing them and recognizing them. He says, "V'ata omar l'chaklal betam mitzvot rabot." He says, I'm going to tell you something that is actually the reason for many commandments. From the time of Enosh in the book of Breshit, when idolatry began, people got confused about faith. There are people who would say that the world always existed, as opposed to God creating it ex nihilo. And some people would deny that God knows what's going on in the world. And there were those who would say God knows what's going on in the world, but they would deny that God has providence over what happens, meaning that God punishes, that God rewards, that God gets involved. And he says, but when God desires a group or an individual, and does for them a wonder, in changing the way of the world and its nature, as with, suppose we say, as with Kriyat Yam Suf, splitting the sea, but maybe even as with upending the natural order, which would be that the empire of Egypt should be winning, right? Then yitbarer l'kol bitul hadeot ha'elekulam. Everybody will be clear that they were wrong. Ki hamofet hanifla, because a great wonder, moreh sheyesh la'olam Eloha mechadsho, shows that there is a God who is mechadesh, right? A God who renews it. V'yodea u'mashgiach v'yachol, who knows, is providential over, and can intervene. And then towards the end of this entry, and it's a long entry, worth seeing the whole thing, he says, Umina nisim agdolim hamufursamim, and from those big famous miracles, based on those, which I'm going to say no one can deny, Adam modeh benisim hanistarim, shehem yesodat harakula. A person will then start admitting to the more hidden miracles. And those are really the foundation of Torah. She'ein la'adam chelek b'torat Moshe Rabbeinu, ad she'na'amin b'chol devareinu u'mikreinu shekulam nisim. Wow. A person does not have a portion in the Torah of Moshe, our master, until we believe that everything that happens, shekulam nisim, that they are all miracles. Ein behem teva. There is no nature. Uminhago shalalam. There is no natural law over them. Bein b'rabim, bein b'yachid. Whether we're talking about collectives or we're talking about individuals. Ela im yaseh mitzvot yatzilchenu scharo. Rather, if you do mitzvot, you're going to be rewarded, and that's what makes you successful. V'im yavor alehem yachritenu onsho. And if you're going to do avirot, then your punishment is going to punish you. It's going to cut you off. Hakol b'gzirat elyon, right? It's all through God's decree. Amazing. Literally the opposite of the Rambam. Literally the opposite of the Rambam. He wants you to know that there's constant miracles going on, and only the big miracles help sensitize you to the small miracles. Now, I want to say he still has to contend that there is a concept called Olam Kimina Gonoheg. He learns the Gemara. He has a perush on the Gemara, right? So I want to show you two places where he uses Olam Kimina Gonoheg to still fit into this way of thinking. One is when he's talking about the Shulchan, the table in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, on which the Lechem Apanim, the showbread, was put. And he says the following in his explanation on Shmot Kafeh. Shezeh Soda Shulchan, here is the secret of the table. Ki Birkat Hashem me'et heyot ha'olam, since the world has been created, the divine blessing, lo nivra yesh me'ayin, it no longer has to be created or can be created or is created ex nihilo, from nothing. Aval olam kiminhago noheg. Instead, the world works how it works. Tichtiv, as it says, vayar lukim et kol asher asa v'nei tov me'od. God saw everything that God had made, and it was, behold, it was very good. Aval, ka'asher yesh sham shorish davar, when there is the root of something, Tachol alav habracha v'tosif bo, then bracha can fall upon it, right? Then blessing can fall upon it and can be added. Kasher Amar Elisha, like Elisha says to the woman who asks him, who's begging him and says, I'm a debtor and they're coming to collect my children because I don't have money. He says, Hagidili ma yesh lach babayit. Tell me what you have in the house already, right? So she has a little bit of shemen, she's a little bit of oil, and he says, go get kelim from the neighbors, go get different vessels from the neighbors and pour the oil, and then it just keeps pouring and pouring and pouring, right? Like a Hanukkah miracle, but without the Hanukkah. One sec, I just lost the share. All right. But the point is, that's Olam Kimina Gonoheg, meaning miracles happen through what has already been created in the world. Meaning Kriyat Yam Suf happens through Yam Suf, right? He also uses it to describe Nisim Nistarim, hidden miracles. He talks about hidden miracles as Nisim Nistarim She'olam Kiminhago Noheg Imahem, that the world seems like it's working just the way it usually works through them. And the example is, he's discussing the Tocha in Bechukotai, the rebuke at the end of the book of Vayikra, where if we do good, we'll get rain and everything will go well, and our enemies won't be against us. It should only be so. Our enemies won't be against us. And he says, all these things, it's going to look like, it's going to look like natural because it's rain, right? It's not like no rain falls and then miraculously everything flourishes. There's rain. There's just a lot of rain. And that's what it looks like. So he actually uses the concept of Olam Kimina Gonoheg to say that is an example of Nisim Nistarim, where you might have through nature an actual nes that's happening. It's really such an inversion, the Rambam and the Ramban, and I just think it's absolutely fascinating. So where does that leave us? If Olam Kimina Gonoheg for the Rambam becomes a calling card, so much so that he has to figure out what is a miracle, how does that fit in? Because doesn't seem to be a law of nature. It seems to be an intervention with nature. And the Ramban, who basically goes in the opposite direction, that Olam Kimina Gonoheg, no. That's what it looks like to you. But actually, the world is full of constant miracles. I would say at least two things about this. The first is, I think that the Rambam might be more comfortable for a modern, but in the Middle Ages, there's no question that the Ramban was considered the more appropriate religious response. No question. And in fact, I put another link to an article, or it's really a book chapter about the Ramban as really trying to take on the Rambam and disagree with him. But the other thing I want to say is what the Ramban has that the Rambam lacks is that the Ramban has a sense of divine immanence, has a sense of God being there at all times, which I think that for many religious personalities, that's very important. It's very important. So I don't think it's so easy to pick a side here. I'm just going to be honest. I don't think it's so easy to pick a side. But I hope you've enjoyed this foray, and definitely read the articles if they speak to you or the issues speak to you. Looking forward to next time.